Today, we sat down with former Lieutenant Governor and State Treasurer of Kansas, Lynn Rogers. We discussed his political career as well as many other things. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do the same. All right, we're live. Lynn, thank you for taking the time to come sit down with us.
Well, good. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. You have a really impressive career, both in business and in politics, so it's great to get to speak with you.
Yeah.
If somebody had told 25-year-old Lynn Rogers that you'd be lieutenant governor, what would you have thought?
Frankly, I would have thought they were crazy. As a kid, growing up, I was always interested in politics, and you thought you'd be president of the United States, but by that time I was married. We had a kid on the way. We just moved to Wichita, and just trying to get my banking kind of career underway, I could not have fathomed that. And I think what it really says is that you've just got to be ready for anything in your career. Things could change and pop, and one circumstance or one item can really turn into something down the road that you would have never thought to begin with. So,
when you were a banker at 25, did you have any idea that you were going to get into politics one day? And then what got you into it?
At that point, I had kind of said I probably wasn't going to. My grandpa had been a county commissioner and school board member. My dad had been a school board. Well, actually, my dad became a school board member after I did. In my hometown. What really got me involved was, we came to Wichita. I grew up on a farm in Nebraska. I lived in Chicago, worked for Citibank for 4 or 5 years. We lived down by Lakeshore Drive, and wife and I married. She's a Nebraskan as well. We met in college, and I got a job offer from the Farm Credit Bank here in Wichita, and they were creating this big marketing department. So they hired on around 30 people for this marketing department. So we got to work, and the bank had gone through all of Wichita in 1985 was going through, there was a downturn in aviation, a downturn in oil, and a downturn in ag. So the city was kind of in a bad position. Well, 4 months after I started, they announced 25% layoffs at the bank. They were losing several $100 million a year. And so the marketing department of around 30 people got cut down to 3, and I got to keep one of those jobs. And I really say the reason I got it, or got to keep one of those 3 jobs, was that I had not insulted anybody in the period of time that I was there. I had kept my mouth shut and did my work, and everybody else was kind of insulting the senior managers and whatnot. So I kind of joke about that. But I ended up staying with Farm Credit for around 30 years and traveled all over the Midwest and even to this day, when I was in the legislature and whatnot, I would point out some of the grain elevators that I financed, and staff would get, they'd roll their eyes and whatnot and think. But I was very happy doing the bank, and my wife and I, we had 3 kids. We lived in Riverside. We had a couple old houses that we renovated, and then in probably about 1999, they were talking about a bond issue, and my kids had started Riverside, and it was an old school at that point. And I thought, it was really time. We needed to do that. So I stepped up, and we helped pass the 2000 bond issue. And I was in charge of helping organize all the school parent groups and getting people to turn out to vote. And we were successful. And then one of the school board members that was on the board was going to run for a state job, state senator, Jean Schodorf. And so she asked me to be her treasurer and also to run for school board. So I ran in 2001 as a school board member. And part of it was to make sure that we kept the bond issue on track, that we did what we said we were going to do, because there was not a lot of trust in the district or in the city for the school board. So I joined the board at that point. Really didn't even plan to run for re-election, and then ended up running 3 times after that. So, served 16 and a half years there. And so that's what really got me into that. And I really, probably of all the political jobs I've had, I really like the school board, because I could, be in my community, work at my job and serve, the school board, and also, raise our family. And so so that worked out really, really well. And so that's what really got me into politics the first time. And then, of course, in the school board, we came across all kinds of funding issues and problems. And so we had to kind of constantly work on making sure that we had enough resources for the kids in the schools that we needed to do. But I really enjoyed that. I always called pomp and circumstance was my paycheck because we got to watch the kids graduate. So that was always fun. So
Oh, cool.
So
The school board seems like a difficult job because there's so many schools that need improvements done and resources are so limited.
yeah.
What was your process to be able to decide where resources need allocated?
Well, the budgeting process was very difficult. I kind of took that on as my specialty. I was one of the few board members that really kind of understood how the budget worked. And our funding, actually, a lot of it comes from the state, to what's called the funding formula. And there's several different funds. You can use some money for some things, but not for all things. So, like for instance, when we were doing the bond issue, that went into the capital fund. It could only be used for long-term investments in buildings. A lot of people said, well, just use that for salary. Well, we can't do that. Those are things that were limited. And then the funding formula was based on how many students and high needs and things like that. So we would usually start the budgeting process in January, and we wouldn't approve it until August. So it was about an 8-month process, and we would do everything from hearings where we would have people come in and talk, and then each budget department, each principal would give us kind of their wish list, and then we'd kind of figure it out. Of course, when I served, I served during the Brownback tax experiment, and so we were getting cuts left and right. And I think one year we had to cut $35 million out of the budget, and that a lot of times is, well, that's just your increase. No, that was actually from one year to the next. And so the hard part about with a school district and even your county and your city, the vast majority of what we spend local taxes are on our neighbors, they're the employees, they're people. And so 85 to 90% of our budget was people. So if we were going to make a major cut, we were going to have to cut individuals somewhere, and we always got hit for high administration. Well, we spent less per people than most businesses did, because when I was working, I had a boss and he had 4 people that worked for him. Well, we had managers that had 3 levels that would report to him, 8 to 10, 12. So there was business has a much higher administrative cost than what we were suffering. So part of my job as school board was to help people understand that, to try to talk to them, and of course my problem was I would probably dump too much. I probably have already given you too much information, but you've got to help people understand why and where their money goes, because the two things that people send to public schools, their 2 most important things, their money and their kids. And so you've got to make sure that you're taking care of both of those all the time. You never have a down moment from that standpoint. So
You said when Brownback cut, that was $30 million. Is that what you said?
That was one year. There were several years where we had, we did have cuts of increases, but and so we couldn't give any pay raises or things like that. I don't recall now exactly where it was, but we had some pretty good sized chunks. So
what are some examples, firsthand examples of when you had the 30 million versus when it cut?
When it cut,
where's the money not going now?
Well, what we did at that point was we did cut a lot of administration. There were a lot of things that we had folks doing they always call it downtown. So, now it's at the AMAC Center down on the old Southeast campus. But we would have, coordinators or individuals that would help, file reports and things like that. And when we tried to cut as far away from the classroom as we could, and try to keep the class sizes as small as we could. But what oftentimes that meant was that we took an assistant principal out of a building, and so that the other assistant principal had more kids, or the principal had more kids to take care of. We would cut the folks in the AMAC Center, the administration center. Well, what that meant was that those reports that, unfortunately, when the state cuts all those kind of things, they don't cut the requirements either, and so we still had a ton of reports that had to get sent to Topeka, and so that had to get pushed back out into the classrooms, and the teachers had to do it. The hard part about it is we were probably, from a state standpoint, as a school district, we were probably audited 8 to 12 different types of audits every year. We had an audit team from the State Department of Education or the State Revenue Department or something going almost all time. And, the bank I worked for didn't even get audited that much. I mean, and audits in banks are very important. But people need to understand that the money that they put into public ed and local government, they're very tight requirements of how it's spent, where it's spent, and people don't have a lot of options on. And if it's limited by state law or federal law, like for instance, special ed, the state requirement is that 90% of that gets paid for by the state or the federal government. We were getting about 50% of that paid for by the state or federal government. So, and that's a different fund. Special ed pays for different things, for kids that have, extra special needs. And so what happened was, that 50% that we still had to spend, we had to get that out of general education funds. So that meant fewer dollars for, we didn't pay for certain sports, or we didn't, do a number of different things that other kids could have gotten. So it's that was our concern. I mean, we did challenge the state a couple times in lawsuits. The first one was the Montoy case. We were not the plaintiffs on that. The Dodge City school district was. We joined in at the end to help, and that generated several $1 million for us. And then we went through it again, during the Brownback. They went to what was called block grants, which again cut, we could spend it any way we wanted, quote unquote, which really wasn't the truth. But then we had to, it was a 10% cut from the previous year or something like that. And then we did the Gannon case, which we won as well, which put our funding back, which is really good because that created the funding formula that we're currently under. Unfortunately, now that'll expire in 2027, so there's going to be a battle back in the legislature for that. And there's a lot of folks that don't want to support public education, but they don't understand that it really makes or breaks a community. If you don't have a strong public education system, you're not going to attract employers. You're not going to keep employers. Those are kinds of things that are painful. And private education serves a purpose. It's a great option, but the vast majority of kids are going to be served by public education. And Wichita public schools, it isn't even indicative of the district. I mean, we have a very high poverty level. The city as a whole is not that poverty stricken, but our kids are, because again, we've had white flight and some of those kinds of things. But my kids went to Riverside, Marshall, and North, and they had a tremendous education. They are all doing great things. My daughter's a physics teacher, which I don't quite know where she got that. That did not come from my side of the family. That was not my strength. My son's an attorney, and my youngest is an artist, and so they've all done different things. And I know they did what they've done because of the public education support they had. So.
How do you foresee that going in 2027? Do you have any idea?
Well, there is a task force of the legislature working on it. Unfortunately, a lot of the key players are very anti-public ed, and so I'm not looking forward to that battle. But it's going to be tough. I think one of the good things, we've seen it in other states where a lot of times they want vouchers and things like that. The problem with that is that will really hurt rural Kansas more than it hurts, Wichita. It will hurt Wichita. There's no doubt about it. But 65 of our 105 counties don't have a private school or parochial school in their county, and so if those end up getting created because there's people can be funded for homeschool or private, and they take their kids out, 3 or 4 kids out of a rural school could close it because they'd have to lay off people, and there's already school districts that the superintendent is also the principal of the high school and grade school, and also a bus driver. So those are tough things.
Wow.
So and that's one of my biggest concerns. Our rural part of the state is still hurting and continuing to hurt, and I see it continuing to empty out, and that has implications, of course, for urban areas like Wichita. So.
Understood. In 2016, you won a seat in the Kansas Senate.
Yes.
Then shortly after that, in the 2018 election cycle, you were selected by Laura Kelly to be your running mate for governor. What do you recall most about that campaign and the experiences of that type of important
experience?
Election?
I really never wanted to go to Topeka.
Who'd she run against?
We were in the primary. We ran against Carl Brewer, who was the former mayor of Wichita, and he had entered the race pretty early. Actually, February, I think, of 2015, actually, and then, or no, 2016, I think that's right, because Laura didn't get into the race until December of 17. And then Josh Swatty was the other Democrat. He was a former Secretary of Ag and a House representative from Ellsworth, and now lives in Topeka. So it was a three-way race. Laura kind of got in at the very end. I sat next to her when I got elected to the Senate. Again, like I said, I didn't really want to go to Topeka in the first place because I kind of thought it was a bubble. People acted different. I got there and I realized it is a bubble and they do act different, in the Capitol itself. And they don't necessarily think about the state as a whole. It's just what they can do. But I sat in the back row next to then Senator Kelly, and we would be what we call seatmates. And so we talked quite a bit over the 2-year period of time. And she leaned over one time and said, what do you think? I had already signed on as her treasurer, when she first filed. And so she leaned over and said, well, what do you think about being my lieutenant governor? And I looked at her like, I'm not able to do that. I said, that's not something I thought was what I would ever do. And so she talked me into it. So we ran, and it was kind of a fun race. I said before, when I was an ag banker, I traveled all over the state, and so we got to do it. It was 60,000 miles, during that campaign. And what was kind of fun was even after I was elected, I continued to do a lot of that travel. And I'm amazed at the number of places in this state where the governor or lieutenant governor had never been. I mean, I met all kinds of people on the street, and I would try to stop in and talk to them as much as I could. And, they had no connection to their government in Topeka. And so that was part of my goal, was to make sure that we had as much, one-on-one time as we can. But the Senate race was interesting because, I had run 4 times for the school board, and I was still a current school board member in 2016. And I ran against Michael O'Donnell. He was the incumbent, and he jumped out of the race after about 3 or 4 months. I don't think he thought he could win, and so then that's when he ran for, I think, county commission. But that race was smaller than my school board races. Senate district, you cover about 70,000 people, represent 70,000 people. And, in school board, at that time, those races were citywide. So we were almost 200,000 voters in the, citywide for the school district. So it was a little easier, actually, a little more expensive, but, and it was the first paying political job that I had. Because, again, the school board, you don't get paid. But it wasn't much. I think I got... by the time I left the bank, I retired, I was making about 10% of what I was making at the bank. So, It was a big cut. But I went to Topeka, and you jump right in. I mean, the legislature starts in January. You start 8:30 in the morning with committee hearings, and I had agriculture, and then banking, and then Ways and Means, and that's kind of. It's a federal committee, so a lot of controversial things can be there, everything from abortion to immigration. And so that was the morning. And then you met as legislators, as a whole at about 2 o'clock. And that session could be either start at 2 and be over by 2:15, or it could go till 3 or 4 in the morning. And so depending on if you were actually going to be voting on bills, and then if it was a day that you were voting on bills, you had to have amendments ready if you wanted to do that, or your testimony. And there were several times where, either had to, I didn't necessarily carry a bill, but I tried to uncarry a bill, in the sense where you were the main person to debate the other senator. And it's very formal, it's not, Troy, I want to talk to Senator Troy. It's the senator from Sedgwick. Would he answer a question? You always refer to the senator as from the county that they're from. And so, it takes a little while to get to know, what county they're from. But you build a lot of really good relationships. I had as many friends on the Republican side as I did on the Democratic side. And the Democrats, we were a small group, but we knew what was going on. And we really... Sometimes you get told how to vote, is what people tell you. But our minority leader, the only thing he ever required of me was that I support public ed, and that's why I got elected there in the first place. But what probably amazed me the most about that seat, and a little bit too with Lieutenant Governor, was I walked in the chamber the first day where I'm getting sworn in, and I'm thinking, I know a lot about education because of my service on the school board. I know a lot about banking. I know a lot about agriculture. But, what I was amazed at was how many other topics, that we talked about. I mean, everything from Department of Labor to amusement park rides to, adoption, and I mean, all kinds of things that, you had to depend on your colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, to ask questions in their committee and even on the floor to help you understand. And then the longer you go in the session, the first few bills are pretty pure. It's just you're supposed to talk about one topic. But what would happen really in the last week was that they would put 8 to 10 bills together into one bill, and then you had to vote on it. And 7 of those 8 bills could be just wonderful, great for the state, and one could be just absolute garbage. And so you had to decide, were you going to vote for all of it or none of it? And so those were the tough decisions to make, was to deal with that. And then we had the first, and I kind of looked at my Topeka experience threefold. I had 2 years in the Senate, 2 years as lieutenant governor, and 2 years as a state treasurer. And I really felt that there was something major that I did in each one. And the first one, of course, was we undid the Brownback tax experiment, where there were 300,000 people that were not LLCs that were not paying taxes at all, and so that meant you and I had to pay a lot more than our fair share. So we undid that, and then we funded education. That was when we passed the funding formula to do it right. And so that was very significant to me, because I'd started the process when we at the school board, where we approved the lawsuit for Gannon, and then we were able to approve the funding formula that the Gannon case signified. So
go back to the LLC thing real quick.
Yeah,
because I'm actually a CPA and do taxes.
Yeah.
What was the LLC deal back then? Were you not paying state tax?
You didn't have to pay any state tax if you were an LLC. You didn't even declare it in your personal income. It was just
that's wild.
It was a huge hit, and it's why our roads were so bad. Why why the schools had to be cut. That was one of the things when we undid that. Then that's what put us back on track to actually fund. And we've actually had refunds and funding. Like in the state treasurer, I got over there. We had to redo some major software. A lot of our computer systems in the state had not been updated for years. I mean, that's why we had the problem with the Department of Labor during COVID, was that was a 20-year-old system, software system. And, they were still having to pull out folks that had written the code originally in 1975, bring them back to try to write it. So that was, and I've never, I grew up on a farm, and so taxes were a horrible thing, to my dad. And but I always saw too that if we got value for what we spent, I didn't feel so bad about it. With education, when we invested it, that was an investment. That wasn't as an expense. And same with with the state, as I don't want to spend anything more than we have to, but we do have to take care of our kids. We have to take care of our foster care. We have to take care of our roads. Some of those kinds of things. I mean, during the Brownback years, they said. Each of us was probably paying an additional $700 a person just to operate a vehicle in Kansas because of, flat tires and road wear and all of that type of stuff, because the roads were so bad. And, the joke was always, well, we're better than Oklahoma, we're better than Missouri. Well, there for a while, it wasn't too much better. It wasn't a whole lot better. But now, again, we can kind of see that we do have decent roads. And that, again, brings businesses here, transportation hubs and, things like that. So, and again, the more business we can bring here, the more we can spread our tax liabilities across a larger group of people, and all of us spend less. So
yeah, thinking how many LLCs are out there.
Oh, 300,000.
None of them are paying.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that is diabolical.
And a lot of places switch to LLC so they can
right. I was going to ask you. You have like these businesses that are structured as corporations or whatnot.
Oh yeah,
big businesses.
Yeah,
that
there was
probably switched to LLC, and now they're not paying.
Yeah.
They're not paying any state tax.
And unfortunately, we still have a group that kind of want us to go back to some of those things. They want the these big tax breaks, and I look at it and I think we've got to have good corporate citizens as well as individual citizens. So.
Yeah, think about it like the lady working at Walmart. Making $40,000 a year. That's just a W-2 employee.
Yeah.
Paying 5% to Kansas, while this dude living in Eastboro that has an LLC ain't paying a damn dime to Kansas. That's bullshit.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that's why Kansans and we're at Wichita, we don't really engage in state politics like we could or should. We have leaders from here, of course, that represent us, but we don't get a lot of coverage of what's actually going on, what's happening, and so we don't always understand or realize the consequences of our actions. And so, so I think that's one of the things that we need to help people understand is what that means. When someone's not paying their fair share, that's not just that they're getting off and they're getting a good deal. It's I'm paying more.
Right.
So
right.
So.
Why do you think people change so much when they get to Topeka? Because you see that with DC as well.
Yeah.
It just seems like you never really know who you see them on camera, but you never really know what that person's like.
I always felt there's people get elected or try for two reasons. One, they're there to help people. They want to make a change and improve the lives of the people around them. Or there's people that get elected for ego reasons, and unfortunately, there's a number of people when they get to Topeka, they act different. There's a lot of lobbying receptions and a lot of alcohol and a lot of things that put them in not necessarily the best situation. But the press is very hesitant to cover some of that because again, if they write a story about somebody misbehaving, they're going to be limited for access to. Just even this last year, we saw reporters being banned from the floor of both the House and the Senate, and so they had to report from the balcony. The hard part about that is that they can't jump in and ask somebody quick enough and get them on the record, and so people know that their behaviors don't always get covered back home. And so, they kind of get by with it. But if you're there just for ego reasons, oftentimes it's, you get elected and then, what's my next position that I'm going to run for? And that was the hardest part for me of running from, Senate to Lieutenant Governor in 2 years. It's like, everybody said, well, that was really fast moving up in the world. Well, you don't sit on a school board for 16 and a half years and, that's not moving fast, from that standpoint. Mm-hmm. But I wasn't doing it just for that. I knew that we had an opportunity to change. And if we didn't particularly change out a lot of our secretaries of a lot of the departments, the heads of those departments, Department of Revenue and DCF, Children's and Family, we were going to have really pay a huge price as a state because things were not moving in the right direction in that regard. So,
do you think, because from the outside, people that aren't into politics, especially on the federal level, they're, to me, and this is an over-exaggeration and I know it, but they all feel like they're crooks. Do you think that especially national politics attract a certain type of person, or do you think the machine just gets you?
Well, I think sometimes it's the machine and the people around them. To me, it's oftentimes I know the individual, that serves as the. I know our whole congressional district, or our senators and things, and I think, they're good people. And, it's not that they're crooks, or I don't even think any of them are taking money on the sly, type of thing. But they do have to feed the system in such a way that in order to get reelected, they've got to be raising money. So they're always asking somebody for money. That's probably the hardest part of an elected's position, is that you're constantly on the phone trying to raise money for the campaign. Because if you don't, someone's going to come against you. And so, but I do think there's folks, particularly we've got people on the far right and the far left, and their job, their PAC or their whatever, want to move people away from the middle over to those two sides. And so that's what ends up being the problem. And we don't have enough people that say, wait a minute, let's, what do we agree with? In the Senate, we probably voted 100% together on 90 to 95% of the bills that came through. There were just a few that were, very partisan, and some of them weren't even partisan. They were, it didn't happen often, but occasionally, there would be a bipartisan group that would join together one side or the other. Because again, most of the bills, are basic. They're cleaning up a bill or a problem that happened somewhere, and so they're trying to fix that. And if there's a great disagreement, oftentimes the committee chairs would make the lobbyists work out the compromise in between, and that's what would work. The role of the lobbyist can affect it as well. I always found I had great relationships with a lot of the lobbyists, and I kind of tested them. I would come in and ask them what their position was, and then I would ask them to tell me what their opposition's arguments were, and then they would articulate those. And then when the opposition lobbyists would come in, I would ask them the same thing. And if they both said what the other said, if they presented their opponent's arguments the way that the opponent presented, I realized, okay, this is somebody I can trust. This is somebody that's shooting straight with me and not trying to pull the wool over my eyes. So I think there's some things that, again, people can do. But, I had some pretty good experience in the business world for 30 years. So people just didn't snow me, and it wasn't, being in Topeka, it wasn't a job for me that some people get to Washington or Topeka and think, oh, this is such an awe-inspiring, it's such a big deal. And it is a big deal. There's no doubt about it. But, I'd done a lot of great things, big things, with my family and my kids and school board and stuff. So it wasn't that bad. The only thing that probably impressed me the most was the lieutenant governor's office was this huge, huge room.
Felt like you were staying at the Ritz.
Well, it's beautiful. I had Berger Sanzane paintings on the wall. I had a desk from the 1930s, and all these kinds of things. And my brother was there one time, and he says, "You know what Dad would say?" And I said, "Well, what would he say?" He said, "This would hold a lot of hay." So every time I went in there, I kind of thought of that. Yeah, it's a big room, but it's just a room, But it was cool working in the Capitol. It's kind of, half museum, half office, half art. Museum. So a lot of things going on at the same time. So
that's cool. So around that 2016 time was when you changed your political affiliation from Republican to Democrat. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Whether it's one way or the other, I admire your willingness to listen to the other side. I don't think we get near enough of that today, and I think that's a big reason why we have the issues we have today.
Yeah.
In today's political climate, we just get none of that. It's either you fall in line or the machine will back another candidate against you.
Right.
We're even seeing that with Thomas Massey in Kentucky.
Right.
He's staying on the Epstein thing, and now the machine is backing somebody and going really hard at him.
Yeah.
Was it just frustration under Brownback that got you?
That's what got me. The reason I ran was that my senator at the time refused to talk to us about education. He wouldn't come to, and most of the Wichita delegation of Republicans wouldn't come and talk to us. They would just blame us that we were at fault or the kids weren't doing well enough and didn't understand what was going on. And so that's what really, and the fact that we weren't seeing any funding from that. And I thought I could be more effective there.
Mm-hmm.
I took it. It was serious, because my sister, my dad and grandfather both served in different things as Republicans, and so it's a long time thing. But for me, I'm in the middle. I don't, the extremes aren't something that I'm comfortable with. I mean, we need those people pushing and pulling, but at the same point, we've got to come back together and agree. And I think, like you mentioned with Massey and other things, is I think that's one of the reasons why people won't challenge. The party demands loyalty, and that's true on the Democratic side too. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If you and there's a certain level of elitism on both parties, mm-hmm. And so. Until people say, wait a minute, time out. And again, for me, what I thought about was I'm really representing those 70,000 people here in Wichita more than anything else. I remember going to a neighborhood association meeting and some people were really mad at me. Well, you're a Democrat. You're not going to represent me. And I said, you may never vote for me, But if you have a problem with state government, an agency or whatever, you still need to call me, because whether you're a Democrat or Republican, I'll represent you, because that's my job. And we actually, Senator Faust Godot and myself, we actually handled more constituent calls from Wichitans from all over the city than almost anybody else, because we were concerned about that. And so, you still got to do your job as a senator, so to me, the party didn't matter once you got elected, and that was even how I worked at school board. I mean, you may not have voted for me, but I still represented you, at that point. So I do think we need some more of that, and folks just to say, I'm not listening to the party, and I want to think independently, because oftentimes, and I remember one particular bill. It had to be passed. The Republicans were trying to pass it, and we passed it. I mean, and several of us stood up. It came through Fed and state, and we said, these are the problems that we're going to have. It had to do with the amusement park rides. There was one of the legislators' sons was killed, and so they were going to put more regulations on it, which was horrible, and it needed to be taken care of. But it also was then affecting these little private county fairs in rural Kansas, where they had a nonprofit amusement ride, and they were going to be regulated the same way as a Worlds of Fun or something like that. And we just said, that's not going to work. Well, 3 times in that legislative session, we had to come back and change the bill, because they wouldn't stop and listen to, what are the consequences of what's going on. And so I think one of the nice things about having 2 fairly equal parties is that it makes both sides have to listen to the other side to say, oh, wait a minute, that's, you got the votes, but do you understand what's going to happen? That's where we need to be, as opposed to just, I'm self-righteous and I'm no matter what, I'm going to be right. I've never been that. I don't think I've ever been that way, and I know I've not always been that right. I mean, just ask my family. I'll tell you often. So. Yeah. But it was a major decision. I mean, it wasn't an easy thing. I did get a lot of pushback from people, but the vast majority of people, school board, you don't run as a party position. It's non-partisan, and I really like that. I think our judges should be nonpartisan. I think there's a number of positions that should be nonpartisan. They always say that like even if city council is nonpartisan, a pothole is not Republican or Democrat, and same with school. It's not a Democrat or Republican issue. So.
It's a good reminder that the everyday Republican has way more in common with the everyday Democrat than you do the DC politician that you like, that you agree with.
Right.
I don't know.
And it shouldn't be big news when somebody, steps outside of their, party. It should be, what is your, if you're saying you have common sense, then let's have common sense without necessarily the party label. So.
It should be celebrated, because it just proves you're critically thinking.
Yeah.
You're not just a zombie out there voting R or D. You've thought about it.
You're right.
If you switch, or, if you disagree with your party on a certain thing, that at least tells you, okay, your brain works.
Yeah. And you read history, there's a lot of cases on, both parties that did some really dumb things, and, how they've switched positions over the years, and because a lot of people say, well, the Democrats were, racist to begin, and they were, and they had the Tammany Hall stuff, and at the same point, I've just been reading several things with Lincoln and the right after Reconstruction, and there's some horrible things that the Republicans did right after that period of time too, and they were a fairly new party at that time, so there's guilt on all sides, and it's kind of like, okay, where do we go from here? So
No, I've got a lot of respect for that. As Lieutenant Governor, you oversaw the Office of Rural Prosperity. Which address issues in rural Kansas. I saw broadband access, infrastructure, housing.
Yeah.
With your upbringing, growing up on a farm, that had to be a full circle moment for you?
That was I really enjoyed doing that. The only thing that is required of the lieutenant governor is that we have one. There's one phrase in the Constitution that says you'll have a lieutenant governor, and there's no other duties. Some states, the Secretary of State serves as the lieutenant governor. Others, they serve as the president of the Senate. They make the deciding vote. There were some times that would have been kind of fun, but I didn't have that opportunity. But the Office of Rural Prosperity, we did a lot of visits all over the state. We toured, I think, 10 locations. We kind of cut the state up into sections, and we went out and visited and talked to people. And that, again, is where a lot of the people I met that, I've never had the lieutenant governor in my bakery or whatever. And so we got to explore a lot, and then we had an evening where we talked about what were the priorities, and those were the 3 top ones. And what's interesting, one of my observations afterwards was, those are the same issues that we have here in Wichita. We need housing, we need childcare, we need broadband, those kinds of things. And then, of course, the second year was COVID, so we did it all virtually, same kind of thing, but not quite the same. But because we had started that broadband, there were a few counties that were starting to put some broadband plans in place, and so there was some COVID money available, and they could use it just right away. That first funding for the COVID recovery had to be spent real quick, and so those worked. So that was kind of fun to watch. And then we saw, how housing expensive it is, and it's just continue to get worse, And so tell
us about it.
Yeah,
we're well aware.
Yeah,
and the interesting thing is the legislature then did respond. They put some money into rural housing, and they started working on some of that. And so I was very, very proud of that. That's the stuff, as I said, about those 2-year increments that I was really proud of, that we had made some changes, and there was some focus on rural Kansas. Unfortunately, since then, and because of the tariff policies now, rural Kansas is really hurting. We've not sold $1 of soybeans, to China, and not only does that affect an individual farmer, even if they get subsidies from the federal government, that is going to hurt every supporting business in that small town. There's not going to be grain to go through the elevator, and that they sell it and they make money that way, and then that gets returned to the community. And an elevator closes its one of its branches, from a full-time house to a seasonal, and so they lay off 3 people, and those kinds of things are going to really hurt. And if you drive through rural Kansas now, you see so many of them, kind of emptying out. And there's not a lot of future for some of the folks. So that really hurts my heart, because I still have family on the farm in Nebraska, and nieces and nephews that are wanting to farm, and it is very expensive. I mean, right now the tariff, if there is subsidies, it's really a buyout or a payback to the big multinational grain companies and Pioneer and Syngenta, all the big chemical companies and things, because farmers have to pay those bills if they've raised the beans, and raised the corn. They can't, even if they can't sell it, they still have to have paid for all the input costs at some point in time. So those are the things that worry me about long-term future. There'll always be people farming, but they won't be the small family farms that and I even look at a 2,000 acre as a small family farm now. I mean, it's particularly if you're in close to an urban area, you can do some small vegetable growing and some specialty farming, but you can't really do that when you're out in the big wide open spaces. So,
did you end up going to any places that you look back on and really enjoyed, or met any cool people on the road?
I got to be at a lot of different things that, I went to Winfield, visited.
I like Winfield.
It's a great little town.
Yep.
Yeah. And, we went everything from the little brewery there,
right.
Ladybird to, we went to Ark City to the beef plant. And so we got to do things that, an ordinary tourist probably couldn't have gotten to do, or they would have had to work hard on it. So I know the office gave me that opportunity, to visit some places that I kind of always wanted to visit. In other cases, I didn't get to do everything. I mean, I told people, my wish list was I wanted to go through the Hostess plant in Emporia, eat a cupcake or something, but they didn't let me do this with that kind of stuff. But you got to put on other places. You put on hairnets. You put on. You got to visit with people. The office opened up the door for a lot of situations that you wouldn't have normally get to have. So
cool.
But
that's cool. When you were treasurer, during that time, one of the big initiatives was expanding the 529 program.
Yes.
With college becoming more and more unaffordable for everyday Americans, what are your thoughts on the landscape, and is this sustainable?
The rising cost, that and the lower number of students, it's really going to affect our higher education, and then some of the attacks on higher education too from the federal level is really going to hurt them as well. That's one of the weaknesses I think right now of our societies, where we think that being educated is a negative, not a positive. And so I think that's part of it. We wanted to expand the 529 so that people could get the deduction, they could save on their taxes and save money. I was really amazed at how many people didn't know about it. And so we worked as hard as we could to get the word out. I also wanted to expand, we wanted to create a similar type of thing for IRAs, where, because there's a lot of small businesses that, don't pay any retirements. And so we thought if we could give some kind of a tax credit to individuals putting in some money for retirement now, and then 40 years down the road, they'd have some money, because there's not going to be enough for people to live on, Social Security alone. They're going to have some additional savings from that standpoint. We didn't, unfortunately, get that. We did several, big events to kind of publicize it. Kathleen Kennedy from the Federal Department of Labor came to Kansas to talk about it, and we tried to encourage that, but we didn't. That was one of our things that we didn't make. So
Kansas did just start, or a couple of years ago, the classroom supplies tax credit, $250 or $300, because the federal side gives you the deduction, but Kansas started allowing credits for teachers up to, I don't know, remember if it's $250 or $300, but that's just common sense stuff there.
It's interesting. People, and the 529 program, it's invested well. I started ones for each of my 3 grandkids, and it's amazing how much it grows. Even putting in a couple $100s a year can make a huge difference. Now I'm afraid it's not going to be enough for when they're ready for school in 15 years. That's going to be tough.
Compounding interest,
but
beautiful thing.
It's going to be better than nothing.
Tuition compounds faster.
So if the other grandparents do it and parents do it, it'll start making a difference. But
you just be surprised what money turns into after 18 years.
Of all the, I loved being a school board member, but in Topeka, my favorite job was state treasurer, because I really felt like I found my voice. I was able to talk about finances. It fit with my banking career for so long. I remember sitting down with the staff the first day, and one of our key staff people started talking about, investment rates and all these different banking terms. And she looked at me like my eyes were going to glaze over. And I said, okay. So, I was just checking them off. And she looked at me and says, well, you know what those mean? And I said, yeah. And she said, oh, we haven't had a treasurer for a couple of years that knew how to do that. And the biggest fear was that we got there in our unclaimed property, which, it's $600 million of your taxpayers' money and my money that's come from, a bank account that we've forgotten about, or even worse, what we often
We've got some.
Yeah, did you? Good.
But no, we still have it. It's still unclaimed. I got to claim it.
Oh, you got to get in there.
Yeah, we're up in Manhattan. I think it's like Evergy. We had an Evergy bill or something.
It's rebates or deposits for apartments and things like that.
States been holding our money for like a decade, and I just haven't gotten in to do it.
There's a different treasurer now, but call the 800 number, and the staff are great. They will help you walk it through. If there's a form you need to sign, they'll do it. They'll send it to you electronically. But there's a lot of money that just gets unclaimed, and ultimately, Ohio does it where they actually use the earnings from unclaimed property to fund their arts, communities throughout the state, which that was an idea somebody presented to me this week. And I thought, well, that's a great idea, because the money does get earnings, but it goes to the state general fund. So it would have to make a decision. But I think there's some things that can be, during the Brownback years, we've spent it all and then we've had to, fund it back, but we had to do that. But the big problem was that the software was 20 some years old. We had written it ourselves. The staff person that did it was still there, but they had banned him from updating it. And so we were coming up within a year of a deadline that for national law, national rules, that we had to change something. Our software wouldn't support that. So we had to very quickly get the funding from the legislature, after the session started, and got that all revamped. And so we were able to do that in about a 2-year period, meet the time frame that we had. But it was one of those things that just should have been done and should have been in place before. And, again, I think it was a case where somebody got elected for the position, but not necessarily doing the job. And I mean, I showed up there every day, 7:00 in the morning, and the third day I had staffers walking by, and they'd look in and they'd say, he's here. And, because they just didn't ever see the previous treasurer. And I think that, wow, that's what I was getting paid for. Why shouldn't I be there? And then it was fun to go out. We traveled all over the state. I would stand in the lobby of a Dillon store and ask people when they came in, have you checked your unclaimed property? And we found all kinds of money for all kinds of people, and so that was fun. My best story was the Republicans were very upset that the governor had appointed me a Democrat to a position where it had been a Republican elected, and so one of the party faithful went and testified, and the legislature, how that wasn't fair and wasn't right and whatnot. And I said, well, they'll get to decide in 2 years, and they did. But I called him the next day and I said, did you ever live in such and such town? He said, no, I've always lived in, Johnson County. And I said, well, do you have a son named Jacob? And, well, yes. Why are you asking? I said, well, he's got several refunds from, paychecks from Quick Trip and refund from K-State. And it's almost $600. And he was in graduate school. And so, I noticed about a week later, the money was claimed and gone. And it never came up the rest of my term, in terms of, making it a stay with the party that got elected. So I thought, okay, at least I got my point across.
You didn't get a thank you, though?
I didn't get a thank you, but every time they got their money, I felt better about that one. So, but I mean, we found one company, they had $4 million that they did not know about that had been turned over to us. And I found another one that was a $400,000.
You know expense. How? Do you have any detail on that? How did that happen?
It was I believe it was an Apple stock, and the two children didn't know that the parents had it, and so the investment firm, had it for several years after the parents died, and they turned it over to us. And I don't even know if they even looked for the kids, because we found them, right away, and unfortunately they had closed off the estate, so they had to reopen the estate. But I said for $4 million, because that was a vast majority of their net worth was the stock. So
wow,
the parents didn't think the kids didn't think they had much money left to them. So those are the kind of fun ones where it goes back to some people that really could use it and need it. So
wow.
So I tell people all the time, even if you lived in another state, go to that state as well, because you could have a deposit from an investment, you could have a refund, a rebate of some kind. Sometimes it's not a lot of money, but it's better in your pocket than in the States because you're not making anything on it. So
right.
I mean, I found money for my, I had a niece that found money. I found money for my daughter. It was under her maiden name, not under, and she now lives in Missouri. And so, that was kind of fun to look at some of that. I also looked up every legislator that we had.
Can you look that up on, where do you look that up? Kansas Department of Revenue?
No, it's Kansas State Treasurer. I can't remember the website right off.
Look up Troy Dewey on that.
Yeah.
We're about to get rich.
Just look up Kansas State Treasurer and or unclaimed property Kansas. They can find it that way. And it's amazing how much you can find for people and get back to them. So
that's amazing. What a surprise that had to be.
Yeah, for some of those, when you made those were kind of fun phone calls to make. Is
and the fact that the government actually held that for you and did, it just didn't get washed away into the universe. Is pretty amazing.
Our biggest problem though is we would have people call and or we call them and they didn't know. So
I have two.
Oh yeah,
yeah. Look at you.
Now they don't say the dollar amount, but yeah, you've got. So they say the ones under they're under 100. So
Blake, you get a fourth of that when
AT&T
when I go claim.
AT&T owes you less than $100, and One Gas owes you more than $100.
Wow, I'm starting to sweat.
Yeah,
look at you.
So look at the 800 number and make it a call. So but yeah, and there's no cost. There are people that will call you and say I can find it for you for a fee. Don't fall for that.
Do they write you a check, or can you get that direct deposited?
I believe they can do direct deposit, but I know they'll send you a check, so that's not a problem. But I think you could give them the information, and they can direct deposit it into your account too. So
Man,
Wow.
that's pretty good.
Yeah.
That is good.
Well, and I've gone in a lot of times. I haven't done it for a while.
This
but
podcast just made me more money today.
Yep.
I would oftentimes, if I was bored, in my apartment in Topeka, I would look people's names up and I would text people and say, "Did you live at such and such?" And they, "Oh yeah." And I said, "Well, you got money with us," and so it was always kind of fun to, And I had one person say, "Is this really Lynn Rogers? Am I getting scammed here?" It's like, no, that's really me.
That's pretty good. So, in 2022, you ran for full term for treasurer.
Yep.
But were defeated. I'm a firm believer there's valuable lessons you can learn in defeat. I think it builds resilience, provides fuel for improvement, and the ability to just reassess. It also makes you appreciate winning more.
Yeah.
Were there any lessons you took away from the 2022 campaign?
It's not fun to lose. But actually, I knew it was going to be a heavy lift. The Democrat in Kansas on a statewide basis, that was not going to be easy. But I worked really hard. We raised a lot of money. We traveled all over. We got to talk about some really important issues. The hard part is when you're a down ballot candidate, it's not as easy. People will vote for the top candidate sometimes, and sometimes they'll only vote for so many Democrats, at a time and whatnot. But I did learn a lot. Running a statewide race is not easy. It's, you're 105 counties, and you've got hundreds of people telling you how to campaign or how to run. And it's hard to get people excited about, finances, even if it's one of the biggest things that affects our lives, on a regular basis. But, I look at it as that we did everything we could. We didn't leave anything on the field. We worked to the very last minute. We raised probably more money that a down ballot Democrat had ever raised.
When you say down ballot?
That's anything under your top. So on a ballot, the first candidate is usually the highest office, and then it drops down.
Oh, okay.
So it'd be governor, attorney general, secretary of state, and treasurer, and then insurance commissioner.
Gotcha.
And then you'd have your state house and all those kind of things. That's like school board would fit all the way down to the bottom, and constitutional amendments go at the end and stuff. So that down ballot, people don't think about it. They, and so.
Do you think as a Democrat that gives you a better chance or a worse chance? Because you would think that people that are voting on down ballot, unless they're just R across the board or D across the board, have an actual purpose for doing that. Do you think the minority party has a better chance of getting elected there versus governor?
Yeah.
I mean, we got a Democratic governor, but still.
Yeah. It took a lot of work to get the Democratic governor twice, but no, because I think people do just look at the R and the D. They don't stop to think about it. I think also with a name like Lynn, people thought I was a woman, and so I think that also kept people from sometimes voting for me. So
Wow.
we had a senator or a treasurer, Lynn Jenkins, who then went on to Congress, and female, and so that people would look at me and say, "Oh, I didn't know you were a guy." So and so you just kind of take that, But I had a great team. I had, people that traveled with me. I had people back in the home office. We did a lot of events where we would, meet people and talk to people. I really felt like I got my message out there. It just it didn't resound enough. I thought maybe one of the more difficult days for me would be leaving Topeka. We had an apartment that was just downtown. I loved it. I could walk to the Capitol or my office. But after I all packed up and was driving home, I was leaving Topeka, and I could see the Capitol in my rearview mirror. But what I really realized is that I thought something very significant in each of those 2-year increments, and something that probably nobody else could have done. And so, I was very proud of what we had accomplished. And so when I came home then, I took about a year to kind of think and reflect, and read a lot of books, and did not get involved, with anybody or anything, tried to lay low, so to speak. And I have tried pretty much over, I tried to do some stuff with the Democratic Party and didn't make that. And so I backed off and just said, okay, I'm just going to lay low and be, kind of work in the community. And so that's what I've done. But it's been really fun just to, be ordinary. It's nice to read the paper and know my name's not going to be in it, and so I don't have to worry about that kind of stuff. Or if it is, then I really worry about it. But but it's and I miss the people. A number of the people that I worked with, both the legislative research staff, the legislative legislator revisers that worked on the laws and things. A lot of the secretaries, the department, my state treasurer's staff were just wonderful. They had probably a dozen treasurers in the last 10 years. And my first day, one of the guys came in and told me he'd been with the treasurer for like 33 years. And he said, I think you're my 12th treasurer. And, which kind of woke me up, because I thought, wow, these people have been here a long time. This is their life, so I don't want to screw it up.
Sure.
So.
No, I think you have every reason to keep your head high. Sounds like all the work you've done throughout the years, and you left no stone unturned in the campaign. So.
Yeah. And to me, it seems like you left it a better place than when you found it.
That's how I feel. I feel like, and when I went to Topeka, even in the Senate, I always felt like I was going to vote my conscience, because if I didn't get reelected in 4 years, I would at least be able to go home and look myself in the eye and in the mirror and say, I did what I needed to do. And so I never regretted, how I voted or what I did, in that regard. My other goal was that, I wanted to treat people with respect and dignity. I feel like, I'm still friends with a lot of the folks. I actually bought my last 2 cars from a Republican senator in Concordia, drive up there to, because she's just a good friend. And, and so, there's people like that all over the state that I can still tie into. And, I have kind of an interesting Facebook friends group. There are people from all kinds of levels of, of community. And I got some folks that are very far right, some that are very far left, and whatnot. So
that's healthy.
Yeah. It makes you think, and
it checks yourself too.
Yeah, it does. It's like, okay, why am I thinking this?
Right.
So, yeah.
What advice would you provide young people who want to get involved either in local politics or the community?
Well, I think some folks, I'm going to answer that maybe 2 ways, so remind me to come back to the second way. But the first way is a lot of folks want to get elected right away. They want to get elected at 21 or 22 or whatever, and that's great. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's really important that people represent their constituency. And what I mean by that is that you need to be involved in your community first. You need to either volunteer, you need to understand what your community is saying, you need to know people on both sides of the aisle so that, they, can talk to you. I mean, I felt I could go to Topeka because I'd been on the school board for a number of years. Most people didn't know if I was a Republican or Democrat. So when I switched parties, it wasn't necessarily a real big surprise because they just didn't know. But, I think, so being involved, that's really, really key. And I think you can be involved. That's the second part of the answer is how you can be involved. I think is you just have to figure out how to volunteer. What is it that you're interested in doing? Is there a group that's already doing it? If there's not, what can you do to start doing something? We have a group that's working on the pagoda and the wildlife exhibit in Riverside, and it's just a group of people that want to expand that and do those kinds of things. And they're just several of them mentioned to the staff that were running it that we'd like to do more, and so we kind of put a group together. But other times, I always see people like, and I live in the Riverside neighborhood. It's kind of a unique community because there's so much community. The neighborhood association's been there forever, and if somebody sees a need, they'll organize a trash pickup or just all those kinds of things. And that's what I think you've got to do. I mean, if something needs to be done, jump in and do it. And there's all of our museums need people to help run the gift shops. There are all kinds of volunteer organizations, and you can. What I found, I'm on the trustees for the History Museum. It's a great group of people. There's 25 people, I think, that's on that. All walks of life, all levels, young as well as old. And so it's even introduced me to people that I would have never met, even as lieutenant governor. So I think that's what's kind of interesting is it gets you that opportunity. So.
Gotcha. That's great advice. I was going to ask you about the nonprofit work you've been doing, but you beat me to it.
Oh yeah. Well, I tell people it's fun. I just, when people ask me what I'm doing, they usually ask what I'm going to run for next, and I always tell them, I mean, you never say never, but once you've run for a statewide office, you really don't need to do that again. That bucket list has been checked, and you can go on from there. So when I stepped back and came home, I really kind of decided what I wanted to be involved in, and I had a lot of requests to be on boards and things that I've kind of really limited it. I'm on one statewide organization called KIFA, Kansas Interfaith Action. It's a policy connecting faith with issues like Medicaid expansion and education and some really important issues to me. So it allows me to continue to be kind of on a statewide stage, but on a low-key basis. I'm the treasurer, and so everybody's put me in charge of money. And then I'm on the Education Foundation, Wichita Education Foundation, which has just been created, and so we're trying to raise money that so the taxpayer doesn't have to pay for it all. And then the History Museum and then the Wildlife Exhibit, and we're trying to rehab that old 1911 pagoda. So each of those are kind of they're kind of fun. I've decided I still don't like I had enough committee meetings when I was both in Topeka and in my bank. So board meetings don't really trip my trigger anymore, but I'll do them, so I have to. But if I can help people raise money and introduce people to different needs, I think that's really good. One of my favorite jobs actually is you'll see me in the neighborhood picking up trash. I'll instead of walking, I just can't walk and do nothing else. So I have a bucket and I pick up trash. And I had a last funny story. A woman that I know texted me, and she said, I got my daughter with me, and I just told her that we passed this guy picking up trash, and they said, well, who was that? And she said, well, that was the former lieutenant governor of Kansas. I said, yeah, nobody's too important. But again, I think, and I help with the gift shop at the museum and history museum. But I think it's one of those things. What's fun now is that, if I want to volunteer for something, I do. If I don't, I can say no, and like all of the things that I'm doing, I feel like I don't feel like I have to do them forever. And I think that's one of the things that, young people should think about too, is, when you're signing up for a nonprofit or volunteer job, you don't have to do it forever. Do it one time to see if you like it. If you enjoy it, stick with it, stay for a term or so, and, be a supporter. But, you can do more, just as much, by bringing people into the organization after you leave to make sure that there's somebody to replace you, type of deal. So I think you got to look at the big picture and how do we build the community from here. So
that's great. Humility goes a long way.
It's, I've never grown up on a farm. I think I got my first new clothes when I was in 7th grade. I remember wearing hand-me-downs up until that period of time. And I was so proud of it that I probably bragged to everybody. But, I guess I've never felt anywhere where I'm the most important person in the room. And when people do that and feel that way, I mean, I think it comes across pretty fast, and people don't.
It's very obvious to tell.
Yeah, and it's not needed. You just need to be a genuine person, and
it's super unattractive.
Yeah, but people don't catch it. They don't realize it, and and that was one of the hard things. All of my elected positions, because there are people that will try to suck up to you, and tell you about how wonderful you are, almost, and that's very uncomfortable to me, because
just like a human too.
It is. It's just, but it's still one of those things like, okay. Oh, you gotta say it, but you don't have to give them any special attention, type of thing. So, but
sure. Well, Troy, you got anything?
I don't.
Okay.
Lynn, you got anything for us?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity. I think Wichita, has a great community. We've got a lot of potential, because it's exciting to see young people wanting to stick in, help people understand what's going on in our community. That's really, really important. That's a good key player. And, I think anything we can do to keep you here, others coming back, I think that's really, really key, because Wichita can grow if we work together. And, we're always going to have people that disagree, but we don't have to be disagreeable. We can still be professional, and if you want to be mad by yourself, and, get it out of your system, and then go away. So
you said you help out at the Kansas Historical...
The Wichita Sedgwick County History Museum downtown.
So you're big on old Wichita history?
Yes, yeah.
Have you ever read Wicked Wichita?
Yes, yeah.
I'm like halfway through it.
Oh, are you?
I love it.
When you're done with that one, then there's another book. It's a different author. That one's Joe Stump.
Yeah.
And he lives just right over here in the neighborhood.
We'd like to have him on someday.
Yeah, you should. He'd be he also does Active Age, the newsletter or newspaper.
Okay.
And his wife is Carrie Rangers from the Eagle. But they have chickens, so you've got all kinds of reasons.
wow.
To
Bring us some farm fresh eggs.
But there's also one called Wicked Kansas, and Wichita used to have Model T Polo. They would take old Model T cars and cut the tops off, and then there'd be somebody driving and somebody with a stick, and they would, instead of a horse, they would go around, and apparently that did not take off. So, but that's what's so fun about the History Museum is there's some really great stories, that we hear about, and again,
man.
Wichita has some great. If you haven't visited the museum lately, it's always free on Sunday. But
I need to go.
There's some great things going on down there, and super things. So
yeah.
Yeah, we need to do
Late
that.
19th century Wichita was a
was
a Wild West town.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Like, to the bone.
They just acquired some film footage of. It's actually the beach plant when it's being built. So it's like the 1930s, and then we found some photos from like one of the very first air shows in Wichita. Some pasture up north. Both of them were found. I think they found them on eBay and purchased them and brought them home. So they're always acquiring things and doing what we can do. We found some footage actually for the wildlife exhibit that has the moving of the alligators from the alligator pit to the basement of the building. So there's some of those kind of things that are being found all over, and it's really neat to kind of share those if we can. So.
Very cool.
Yeah, how cool is that?
Yeah. So.
Wow. Well, Lynn, thank you so much for taking the time. It's great to meet you.
Yeah.
I really admire your humility and everything you've been able to achieve in your career. So.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me on. So,
Yeah, this was a treat for us. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
It really was. Thank you, sir.